What You Don't Know Can Kill You by Jason Daly, October 11th, 2011. In March of 2011, as the world watched the aftermath of the Japanese earthquake, tsunami, nuclear near meltdown, a curious thing began happening in West Coast pharmacies. Bottles of potassium iodide pills used to treat certain thyroid conditions were flying off the shelves, creating a run on an otherwise obscure nutritional supplement. Online, prices jumped from $10 a bottle to upwards of $200. Some residents in California, unable to get the iodide pills, began binging on seaweed, which is known to have high iodine levels. The Fukushima disaster was practically an infomercial for iodide therapy. The chemical is administered after nuclear exposure because it helps protect the thyroid from radioactive iodine, one of the most dangerous elements of nuclear fallout. Typically, iodide treatment is recommended for residents within a 10-mile radius of a radiation leak. But people in the United States who were popping pills were at least 5,000 miles away from the Japanese reactors. Experts at the Environmental Protection Agency estimated that the dose of radiation that reached the western United States was equivalent to 1 in 100,000 the exposure one would get from a round-trip international flight. Although spending $200 on iodide pills for an almost non-existent threat seems ridiculous and could even be harmful, side effects include skin rashes, nausea, and possible allergic reactions. 40 years of research in the way people perceive risk show that it is par for the course. Earthquakes, tsunamis, those things seem inevitable, accepted as acts of God, but an invisible, man-made threat associated with Godzilla and three-eyed fish, now that's something to keep you up at night. There's a lot of emotion that comes from the radiation in Japan, says cognitive psychologist Paul Slovic, an expert on decision-making and risk assessment at the University of Oregon. Even though the earthquake and tsunami took all the lives, all of our attention was focused on the radiation. We like to think that humans are supremely logical, making decisions on the basis of hard data and not on a whim. But for a good part of the 19th and 20th centuries, economists and social scientists assumed this was true too. The public, they believed, would make rational decisions if only it had the right pie chart or statistical table. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that vision of a person who acts in his or her best interest when given accurate information was kneecapped by researchers investigating the emerging field of risk perception. What they found, and what they have continued teasing out since the early 1970s, is that humans have a hell of a time accurately gauging risk. Not only do we have two different systems, logic and instinct, or the head and the gut, that sometimes give us conflicting advice, but we are also at the mercy of deep-seated emotional associations and mental shortcuts. Even if a risk has an objectively measurable probability, like the chances of dying in a fire, which are 1 in 1,177, people will assess the risk subjectively, mentally calibrating the risk based on dozens of subconscious calculations. If you have been watching news coverage of wildfires in Texas nonstop, chances are you will assess the risk of dying in a fire higher than will someone who has been floating in a pool all day. If the day is cold and snowy, you are less likely to think global warming is a threat. Our hardwired gut reactions developed in a world full of hungry beasts and warring clans where they served important functions. Letting the amygdala, part of the brain's emotional core, take over at the first sign of danger, milliseconds before the neocortex, the thinking part of the brain, was aware a spear was headed for our chest, was probably a very useful adaptation. Even today, those nanopauses and gut responses save us from getting flattened by buses or dropping a brick on our toes. But in a world where risks are presented in parts per billion statistics or as clicks on a Geiger counter, our amygdala is out of its depth. A risk perception apparatus permanently tuned for avoiding mountain lions makes it unlikely that we will ever run screaming from a plate of fatty mac and cheese. People are likely to react with little fear for certain types of objectively dangerous risk that evolution has not prepared them for, such as guns, hamburgers, automobiles, smoking, and unsafe sex. even when they recognize the threat at a cognitive level, says researcher George Lowenstein. He debunked the theories that decision-making in the face of risk or uncertainty relies largely on reason. Types of stimuli that people are evolutionarily prepared to fear, such as cage spiders, snakes, or heights, evoke a visceral response even when, at a cognitive level, they are recognized to be harmless. Even Charles Darwin failed to break the amygdala's iron grip on risk perception. As an experiment, he placed his face up against the puff adder enclosure at the London Zoo and tried to keep himself from flinching when the snake struck the plate glass. He failed. The result is that we focus on the 1 in a million boogeyman while virtually ignoring the true risks that inhabit our world. News coverage of a shark attack can clear beaches all over the country, even though sharks kill a grand total of about 1 American annually on average. That is less than the death count from cattle, which gore or stomp 20 Americans per year. Drowning, on the other hand, takes 3,400 lives a year without a single frenzied call for a mandatory life vest to stop the carnage. A whole industry has boomed around conquering the fear of flying, but while we down beta blockers and coach, praying not to be one of the 48 average annual airline casualties, we typically give little thought to driving to the grocery store, even though there are more than 30,000 automobile fatalities each year. In short, our risk perception is often at direct odds with reality. All those people bidding up the cost of iodide, they would have been better off spending $10 on a radon testing kit. The colorless, odorless radioactive gas, which forms as a byproduct of natural uranium decay in rocks, builds up in homes, causing lung cancer. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, radon exposure kills 21,000 Americans annually. David Repke, a consultant in risk communication and the author of How Risky Is It Really? Why Our Fears Don't Always Match the Facts, has dubbed the disconnect the perception gap. Even perfect information, perfectly provided, that addresses people's concerns will not convince everyone that vaccines don't cause autism, or that global warming is real, or that fluoride in the drinking water is not a communist plot, he says. Risk communication can't totally close the perception gap, the difference between our fears and the facts. Many of our personal biases are unsurprising. For instance, the optimism bias gives us a rosier view of the future than current facts might suggest. We assume we will be richer 10 years from now, so it is fine to blow our savings on a boat. We'll pay it off then. Confirmation bias leads us to prefer information that backs up our current opinions and feelings, and to discount information contradictory to those opinions. We also have tendencies to conform our opinions to those of the groups we identify with, to fear man-made risks more than we fear natural ones, and to believe that events causing dread, the technical term for risks that could result in particularly painful or gruesome deaths, like plane crashes and radiation burns, are inherently more risky than other events. But it is heuristics, the subtle mental strategies and shortcuts that often give rise to such biases, that do much of the heavy lifting in risk perception. The availability heuristic says that the easier a scenario is to conjure, the more common it must be. It is easy to imagine a tornado ripping through a house. That is a scene we see every spring on the news and all the time on reality TV and in movies. Now try imagining someone dying of heart disease. You probably cannot conjure many breaking news images for that one. And the drawn-out process of arteriosclerosis will most likely never be the subject of a summer thriller. The effect? Twisters feel like an immediate threat, although we have only a 1 in 46,000 chance of being killed by a cataclysmic storm. Even a terrible tornado season like the one last spring typically yields fewer than 500 tornado fatalities. Heart disease, on the other hand, which eventually kills 1 in every 6 people in this country and 800,000 annually, hardly even rates with our gut. Our fixation on illusory threats at the expense of real ones influences more than just our personal lifestyle choices. Public policy and mass action are also at stake. The Office of National Drug Control Policy reports that prescription drug overdoses have killed more people than crack and heroin combined did in the 1970s and 80s. Law enforcement and the media were obsessed with crack, yet it was only recently that the prescription drug abuse merited even an after-school special. Despite the many obviously rational ways we behave, so social scientists have only just begun to systematically document and understand this central aspect of our nature. In the aftermath of the Japan's nuclear crisis, many nuclear energy boosters were quick to cite a study commissioned by the Clean Air Task Force. The study showed that pollution from coal plants is responsible for 13,000 premature deaths and 20,000 heart attacks in the United States each year, while nuclear power has never been implicated in a single death in this country. True as that may be, numbers alone cannot explain away the cold dread caused by the specter of radiation. Just think of all those alarming images of workers clad in radiation suits waving Geiger counters over the anxious citizens of Japan. Seaweed, anyone? It should come as no surprise that new technology hits many of the fear buttons in our brains. It is a man-made risk. Much of it is difficult to see or imagine, and the only available images we can associate with it are frightening movie scenes, such as a cloud of robots eating the Eiffel Tower. In the summer of 2001, if you switched on the television or picked up a news magazine, you might think ocean's top predators had banded together to take on humanity. After 8-year-old Jesse Arbogast's arm was severed by a 7-foot bull shark on 4th of July weekend, while the child was playing in the surf of Santa Rosa Island near Florida, cable news put all its muscle behind the story. 10 days later, a surfer was bitten just 6 miles from the beach where Jesse had been mauled. Then, a lifeguard in New York claimed he had been attacked. There was almost round-the-clock coverage of the Summer of the Shark, as it came to be known. By August, according to the analysis by historian April Eisman, it was the third most covered story of the summer until the September 11th attacks knocked sharks off the cable news channels. All that media created a sort of feedback loop. Because people were seeing so many sharks on television and reading about them, the availability heuristic was screaming at them that sharks were an imminent threat. Certainly, anytime we have a situation like that where there's such overwhelming media attention, it's going to leave a memory in the population, says George Burgess, who fielded 30 to 40 media calls a day that summer. Perhaps perception problems have always been there with sharks, and there's a continued media interest in vilifying them. It makes a situation where the risk perception of the populace have to continually be worked on to break down stereotypes. Anytime there's a big shark event, you take a couple steps backward, which requires scientists and conversationists to get the real word out. Then again, getting the real word out comes with its own risks, like the risk of getting the real word wrong. Misinformation is especially toxic to risk perception because it can reinforce generalized confirmation biases and erode public trust in scientific data. Erode public trust in scientific data. During the year following the September 11th attacks, millions of Americans opted out of air travel and slipped behind the wheel instead. While they crisscrossed the country listening to breathless news coverage of anthrax attacks, extremists, and homeland security, they faced a much more concrete risk. All those extra cars on the road increased traffic fatalities by nearly 1,600. Airlines, on the other hand, recorded no fatalities. It is unlikely that our intellect can ever paper over our gut reactions to risk. But a full understanding of the science is beginning to percolate into society. Earlier this year, David and others hosted a conference on risk in Washington, D.C. Risk perception is not emotion and reason or facts and feelings. It's both, inescapably, down at the very wiring of our brain. We can't undo this. What I heard at the meeting was people beginning to accept this and to realize that society needs to think more holistically about what risk means. Ropik says policymakers need to stop issuing reams of statistics and start making policies that manipulate our risk perception system instead of trying to reason with it. He points to the organ donor crisis, in which thousands of people die each year because others are too fearful or uncertain to donate organs. People tend to believe that doctors won't work as hard to save them, or they won't be able to have an open casket funeral. Both false. And the gory mental images of organs being harvested from a body give a definite negative effect to the exchange. As a result, too few people focus on the lives that could be saved. In the end, Sunstein argues by normalizing organ donation as a routine medical practice instead of a rare, important, and gruesome event, the policy would short circuit our fear reaction and nudge us toward a positive societal goal. It is this type of policy that Ropic is trying to get the administration to think about, and that this is the next step in risk perception and risk communication. Our risk perception is flawed enough to create harm, he says, but it's something society can do something about. 2011 statistics, how you will die, lifetime risk. So the number 2 way you die is heart disease, 1 in 6. Number 3, cancer. Number 4, stroke. Number 5, motor vehicle accident. 6, suicide. 7, accidental poisoning. 8, a fall. 9, car occupant accident. 10, assault by firearm. Number 26 on the list is fireworks, 1 in 386,000. So what we want to do is highlight, like you've seen here, highlight some pieces of evidence and then highlight the claim. So I'm going to change this color to pink. And I also made a note on the side that I believe this is the author's claim here, because he does a long introduction before he actually gets to more of a precise claim. So he's leading up to this, and he provides examples previously that lead up to the claim here. So I did highlight this as a piece of evidence to show that people in the United States were freaking out and taking iodide pills, even though Japan's 5,000 miles away. They were really worried about the radiation. And then I just also highlight more pieces of evidence to show how we're irrational. So if you want to focus on that, focus on pieces of evidence to show how irrational the humans are, and also the reasons for that we're just hardwired to be really bad at gauging risk because our amygdala kind of takes over. Okay, and then we're going to transfer over some evidence to our trackers.